Hello again. It's Friday, April 3rd, I guess it is, which makes it the end of week 12 of our semester. And I'm going to try to give you a second lecture right now on Jonson's 1614 play, Bartholomew or Bartholomew Fair. As you can see, I'm back at the picnic table. It's a little bit windy, and I have my doubts about how well my iPad is going to cooperate here, but we'll see how it goes. Last lecture, I was talking about some introductory stuff, obviously relating to Jonson's play, talking about where we can kind of situate it within the overall shape of his career. Making some comparisons between this play and the previous text we read, Every Man Out, of his humor, and introducing, I guess, two big main issues. One had to do with the reflexivity, or, as we say, meta-theatricality of Jonson's Bartholomew Fair, to use the period pronunciation again. So I talked last time about the induction of this play, the framing device that Jonson has, and I tried to compare it to the one he uses, the much more elaborate one that he uses in Every Man Out of his humor. I was trying to set up the general suggestion that this play, Bartholomew Fair, may be, let's say, a more user-friendly Jonson comedy than Every Man Out is, and yet by that token it may be a comedy that is less straightforwardly pleasing to Jonson himself, let's say. This play, Bartholomew Fair, may be one in a very, very interesting way, I think, in which Jonson himself is in part satirizing himself, which is very interesting, and in part at the same time is kind of working out or expressing some of his own resentments and frustrations about how difficult he perceives it to be to sell, so to speak, his vision, his intense, conservative, and yet very passionate humanist vision of what literature is or should be, and what people should care about in the literary domain. Finally, in the last lecture, I was introducing this very, very important topic of festivity, the alteration from normal time and space that occurs when we go into a festival environment, when we experience a festival occasion like the annual street party Bartholomew Fair that provides the occasion and the title for Jonson's play. What I want to do now in this lecture is go ahead and try to get into the first act of this play, and I'm not sure this will take quite as long as the lecture last night, but we'll see. I do think that this play, Bartholomew Fair, is, I mean, frankly, a lot of fun. And I hope that you guys had the sense of that in reading it. And I hope also I'll be able to bring out some of that in this lecture and the next one or two. And I'm not sure how many more I'm going to have to do justice to this text. But let's begin. We begin this play, Bartholomew Fair, in London, obviously, in the city of London proper, in the household of a man called John Littlewit. Now, the name is symbolic or emblematic, like all the names in this play. Littlewit means he's a person of little wit. Wit meaning both sense of humor in the period, but also, let's say, oral, verbal, logical intelligence. That's wit. John Littlewit. Oh, and probably there's also a phallic joke on wit, because wit is a bit like will. So he has a little wit, that's what his name suggests, in more than one sense. So this is not a very nice name for Jonson to give this very important character for his play. We begin in the household of John Littlewit. He is a proctor, we're told. That means he's a kind of legal functionary, not a lawyer, but a bit like a paralegal, maybe, very much like a notary or scrivener. That is to say, somebody who draws up and certifies legal documents like contracts and marriage licenses. But a proctor is that kind of person, that kind of figure, specifically for the ecclesiastical courts. In this period, and up until much later, the English system of law was separated into several different streams. One of them being what's called canon law, which means a whole special area of law for the established church. So that's what a proctor is, this ecclesiastical notary. And there is lurking here a very interesting, but I think very difficult issue in Jonson's play and in the other play that we read around the office of a notary. And I don't know if I'm really going to be able to do anything with this, but I don't think we can pass it by without at least pointing at the issue. Every Man Out of His Humor had a notary in it, a rather important scene where the knight Puntarvolo, as you'll recall, is preparing the contracts that are supposed to fund this ridiculous voyage he wants to go on to Constantinople. Bartholomew Fair has already had a notary, also called a scrivener, in it. He's the guy who comes out and reads those ridiculous articles that are supposed to obtain between Jonson and the audience, and then forces the audience to applaud in advance, which I think is really a brilliant and very funny move on Jonson's part. So here's the point, such as it is. Jonson seems to have a minor obsession, let's say, with notaries, and we may or may not have occasion to come back to that and try to figure out why that might be, but it's worth highlighting as quite an intriguing thing, I think. John Littlewhit, an ecclesiastical notary or proctor. We also find out quite quickly in this play, already in Act 1, we find out that John Littlewhit is also a writer of sorts. He's a playwright of sorts. He writes little plays for puppet shows, and actually he has one on the go, which is going to be performed at Bartholomew Fair. We perhaps already can see Jonson kind of circling in the figure of John Littlewhit. He's got a little wit. He thinks he has a great one. He also thinks he's a playwright, but he's a playwright for a version of the theater, let's say, which is manifestly trivial, puppet shows. John Littlewhit comes on in the first scene having a little monologue about a marriage license he has just been drawing up in his capacity as a proctor. He's just been drawing up a marriage license for a man called Bartholomew Coates. And of course, it happens to be Bartholomew Day, the very day on which he's drawing up this marriage license for Bartholomew Coates. Isn't that neat? And John Littlewhit comes on very pleased with himself at having noticed this nice little coincidence that it's, which he calls a conceit. This nice little coincidence that he's drawn up a marriage license for a man called Bartholomew on Bartholomew Day. He comes on holding this license and saying to himself, "A pretty conceit and worth the finding. I have such luck to spin out these fine things still, and like a silkworm out of myself. Here's Master Bartholomew Coates of Harrow-o'-the-Hill in the county of Middlesex, Esquire, takes forth his license to marry Mistress Grace Wellborn of the said place and county. And when does he take it forth? Today, the 24th of August, Bartholomew Day. Bartholomew upon Bartholomew. There's the device. Who would have marked such a leapfrog chance now? A very less than Ames ace on 2 dice. Well, go thy ways, John Littlewhit. Proctor John Littlewhit. One of the pretty wits of Paul's, the little wit of London, so thou art called, and something beside. when a quirk or a quibblen does scape thee, and thou dost not watch and apprehend it, and bring it afore the constable of conceit, there now I speak quib too, let him carry thee out of the archdeacon's court into his kitchen, and make a Jack of thee instead of a John. Jonson brings this man of little wit on stage just beside himself with delight at how witty he thinks he is, at having noticed this trivial coincidence that he's drawn up a marriage license for a man named Bartholomew on Bartholomew Day. So Jonson clearly is mocking this character, little wit, and one doesn't need to have a very bright light on to see this. Jonson is mocking what little wit looks like in general, having a little wit, a small, trivial, humorous and literary intelligence, unlike the very great form of that intelligence that Jonson certainly thinks that he has. And what makes a little wit? It's what John Littlewit calls a quib, or a quibble, or a quibblen, or a conceit. It's superimposition of two meanings. In this case, the coincidence of a man called Bartholomew getting his marriage license on Bartholomew Day. Two moments of meaning, as it were, superimposed in the manner of a pun or a quibble. So, Jonson satirizing a conception of wit, a conception of literary intelligence and humor, which revolves around puns and conceits and paradoxes, and, at least in a trivial way, revolves around what we've called polysemy, many-meaningedness. And you see where this is going. It's the kind of wit, the kind of metaphysical wit that we find in Donne, and also, of course, find in Shakespeare. Jonson has Shakespeare on the brain in Bartholomew Fair. That's very clear. And I don't mean to suggest that little wit is a figure for Shakespeare, not at all. But I do mean to suggest that that Jonson is satirizing and mocking little wit. The state of having a little wit, I mean. He's satirizing and mocking that in a way that tends, at least, to recall or invoke Shakespeare's kind of sense of humor, his punning, his polysemy, his conceits, and so on. Carrying on with the opening scenario of this play. John Littlewit has a young wife. Evidently, she's very attractive. Her name is Wynne. And she comes on very quickly in this scene, Act 1, Scene 1, at line 20. She comes on having just put on an outfit that he evidently has got for her. She comes on at line 20, and John Littlewit says to her, "Wynne, good morrow, Wynne. I'm merry, Wynne. Now you look finely indeed, Wynne. This cap does convince. You'd not have worn it, Wynne, nor had it velvet, but a rough country beaver with a copper band. Sweet Wynne," he says, "let me kiss it," which doesn't mean kiss the cap. It means let me kiss you. Some part of her, anyway. "Sweet Wynne, let me kiss it. And her fine high shoes like the Spanish lady. Good Wynne, go a little," which means walk up and down a little. I want to check you out. "Go a little. I would fain see thee pace, pretty Wynne. By this fine cap, I could never leave kissing on't." Wynne says, "Come indeed, lie. You are such a fool still." And they banter a bit. This relatively young married couple. We're not supposed to think they're newlyweds, but we're supposed to think they have been married for a few years, I think. They banter a bit. Littlewit keeps on talking up how attractive Wynne is, and finally, at around that line 44, he just says, "Come hither, Wynne." He kisses her again. And then another character enters, and we're now in Act 1, Scene 2, on page 46 of our textbooks. Another character enters, a man whose name is Winwife. Why is he called Winwife? Well, because he's trying to win a wife. He's coming to court Wynne's mother, who is a rich widow. Now, there is a very odd thing that Jonson is doing here with the names of these characters. these first three characters in particular whom we meet in this play, because the names seem not interchangeable, but overlapping in a strange way. We've got Little Wit, Win, Wife. We're making a lot of w sounds early on here in Bartholomew Fair, and certainly the confusion of Win, Little Wit's wife, and this other character who's called Win Wife is striking, and I think probably not accidental, but let's just kind of put a pin in that for now, because we have more basic issues that we want to get on the table. Win Wife comes in because he's come to court Win's mother, and interrupts this hubby-wifey kissy scene that Little Wit is having with Win. Win Wife comes in at Act 1, Scene 2. He says, "Why, how now, Master Little Wit? Measuring of lips or molding of kisses? Which is it?" Little Wit explains, "Oh, well, yeah, I really, really love my wife's outfit. I think she looks really great." And then at around line 8 of this scene, Little Wit says to Win, he says, "Dear Win, let Master Win Wife kiss you. He comes wooing to our mother, Win, and maybe our father perhaps, Win. There's no harm in him, Win." Win Wife says, "None of the earth, Master Little Wit," and he kisses Win, Little Wit's wife. Little Wit says, "I envy no man, my delicate sir." Win Wife, "Alas, you have the garden where they grow still, a wife here, with a strawberry breath, cherry lips, apricot cheeks, and a soft velvet head like a mellicotton." We begin this act, Act 1, Scene 1, with Little Wit making much erotically of his young, attractive wife. Another man comes in, Win Wife, to court Win's mother, and he very quickly gets drawn into this same kind of soft-core erotic business of talking up how beautiful Win is, and indeed of approaching her physically, erotically, and kissing her. And we're not talking about, I think, sloppy stuff here, but nonetheless, we have an intense focus on the erotic attractions of this young and beautiful woman, Win. First of all, from her husband, which is one thing, but second of all, from this other guy, while her husband looks on, and that's another thing altogether. And it goes on, because a third character enters the play at Act 1, Scene 3. His name is Quarles, and he is also coming to court Win's mum, the rich widow. So he's the rival to Win Wife in courting this older lady. Evidently, Quarles also is friends with Proctor John Little Wit. They've been drinking the night before, and they have a whole kind of byplay about, well, we were really wasted last night, and Little Wit is seemingly breaking a kind of decorum of drunkenness by reminding Quarles of how drunk they were. Quarles is the kind of person, seemingly, who takes the view that, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. In other words, what you do when you're wasted with your friends, you don't talk about the next day. In any case, Quarles comes on, and I'm now on page 50 in our course books, and I'm looking at around line 32. Quarles is here complaining about John Little Wit, remembering what they did last night when they were drinking. He says, "Before truth, if you have that fearful quality, John, to remember when you are sober what you promised drunk, John, I shall take heed of you, John, for this once I am content to wink at you." And then Quarles says, "Where's your wife? Come hither, Win." In the stage direction, "He kisseth her." Win actually complains in a way which is, I think, partly playful, partly not. Win says, "Why, John, do you see this, John? Look, you help me, John." Little Wit says, "Oh, Win, fie, what do you mean, Win? Be womanly, Win. make an outcry to your mother, Win? Master Quarles is an honest gentleman, and our worshipful good friend, Win. And he's Master Windwife's friend, too. And Master Windwife comes a suitor to your mother, Win, as I told you before, Win, and may perhaps be our father, Win. They'll do you no harm, Win. They are both our worshipful good friends. Master Quarles, you must know Master Quarles, Win. You must not quarrel with Master Quarles, Win. Quarles says, no, we'll kiss again and fall in. And kisses her again. Fall in, being a bawdy joke. It means we'll have sex. We'll kiss again and fall in. Littlewit says, yes, do, good Win. Win says, very interestingly at this point, so we're in an erotic byplay, which, like many versions and instances of erotic byplay, is always on the verge of going too far, of turning from a joke into something else. And so it is noticeably festive in that way, right? Win, at line 51, says the kind of thing that people sometimes say when a festive scenario or a bit of erotic byplay is going a bit too far. She says, in faith, you are a fool, John. Littlewit says, a fool, John, she calls me. Do you mark that, gentleman? Pretty little wit of velvet. A fool, John. Quarles says, she may call you an apple, John, if you use this. And then Windwife says, pray thee forbear, for my respect, somewhat. And let's pause there and talk a little bit about what's happening. And let's notice, please, how strange, and to use another word, how messed up, how pleasantly but noticeably perverse the action of this play is becoming right away, right here in the first three scenes of the first act. We have almost immediately in this little household, John Littlewit's household, we start with the husband, Littlewit. We have young wife coming on. We have them kissing. Isn't that nice? They love each other. They really dig each other. We have Windwife coming on, kissing the wife. That's a little bit less nice. We have Quarles coming on and really kissing the wife, and in fact making jokes about going to bed with her. This particular scene with Quarles and Win is actually robust enough that the other man here, Windwife, actually objects. He says, pray you forbear somewhat for my respect. Oh, you guys, come on. So we have quite a robust scene, erotically robust scene, which all of a sudden presents us with this young woman, very attractive young woman, all dressed up in sexy clothes, necking on stage with two men other than her husband, while the husband looks on. Moreover, these two men are actually trying to get into bed with Win's mother. So it is pretty nasty right away in Jonson's play, Bartholomew Fair. And everybody's laughing, and they're all friends, and yet there's an undercurrent, right? There's Win, among other things, calling out to her husband, saying, help me, John. There's Win saying to her husband, John, you're an idiot. You're a fool, John. There's Quarles calling Littlewit an apple John. She may call you an apple John if you use this. And the footnote in this particular edition doesn't actually pick this up. But we have the benefit of just having read Jonson's Every Man Out of His Humor, where the character Cavalier Shift, as you may recall, is also called Apple John. He's called Apple John because he's a pimp, and that's a phrase for a pimp. So Quarles is saying, in a way that I think is transparently clear to the audience of 1614, Quarles is saying, before you know it, you're going to find you have really lost this beautiful young woman. This erotic byplay is fun, it's laughing, they're friends together, but it is very much on the verge of going too far. And it's quite spicy, let's say, on the stage right away in Jonson's Bartholomew Fair. Quarles goes into a long speech. So, as I said, both Quarles and Windwife are here to court Win's mum. Windwife explicitly, Quarles a little bit less so, but clearly he's kind of Windwife's rival. Nonetheless, he goes into a long speech, which runs from page 51 all the way to page 53 in our course books. A long speech about how nasty that is. I mean, how nasty to be trying to get married to an older woman. It is a long speech, and it is a very bawdy, very scurrilous, very kind of I have to go have a shower now speech, wherein Quarles is mocking Windwife for running after every rich widow in London. So the top of page 52, he says to him, "There cannot be an ancient tripe or trilobub in the town." These are words for entrails, tripe and trilobub. "There cannot be an ancient tripe or trilobub in the town, but thou art straight nosing it. And 'tis a fine occupation thou confine thyself to when thou hast got one," an older woman, I mean, "scrubbing a piece of buff as if thou hadst the perpetuity of Pan your alley to stink in, or perhaps worse, currying a carcass that thou hast bound thyself to alive. I'll be sworn, some of them that thou art or hast been a suitor to are so old as no chaste or married pleasure can ever become 'em. The honest instrument of procreation has 40 years since left to belong to him. Thou must visit him as thou wouldst do a tomb, with a torch or 3 handfuls of link flaming hot." Link meaning sausage. 3 handfuls of link flaming hot, and so thou mayst hap to make him feel thee, and after come to inherit according to thy inches. And he goes on for a long, long time. In fact, this speech is about 100 lines long. This incredibly bawdy and really kind of unpleasant speech that Quarles has about what it is to be trying to get into bed with an older woman. It's a very long speech, and I think this is a moment in Bartholomew Fair when we have Jonson reflexively having a bit of fun. I've mentioned a number of times, of course, that the real ambition of Jonson's career was to write serious historical tragedies modeled on the Roman playwright Seneca, Senecan tragedies. He brought 2 of them to the stage, the second one in 1611, a play called Catiline, which I added as a link to our Canvas page. I do not want you guys to read it, but if you're interested, you could scroll down and you will just note Catiline is full of incredibly long speeches, the content of which is all serious matters of Roman history and bloody plans for conspiracy and revenge, and it's just heavy, heavy stuff. It's speeches that go on for hundreds of lines. And people absolutely hated that, as they almost had to. I mean, it's incredibly boring. Jonson, here in Bartholomew Fair, he has Quarles launch into this bizarrely long speech. It's 100 lines long. A long speech, but of course the content is entirely different from the content of Catiline. Here we have a very nasty, very bawdy speech about what it is to court an older woman, imagery of her genitals like entrails. Oh my goodness. Imagery of buffing leather, of bringing hot sausage to make her feel you. It's unbelievably dirty, bawdy, sleazy, gross, nasty, whatever word you want to use. So it's as though Jonson is saying to his audience, you hate long speeches, eh? I'm going to give you a long speech that you will like, scumbags. A long speech all about nasty, stinky, dubious sex, and I bet you'll eat it up. And I bet they do. Oh, and of course, in a context already established of this kind of soft wife swapping, a beautiful young wife, Wynne, being, making out, in effect, with 2 other men while her husband looks on. So That's how this play begins. And I hope you will agree that it is a very striking and memorable, even if not wholly wholesome, beginning. And let's try to sum up what the point here may be. In terms of the plot of this play, Jonson is going to take these people and some other people into that fair that we've talked about, that bounded area on Smithfield, where the rules are suspended and it's party time, it's festive time. He's going to take them into an immoral space. That's the narrative goal of this play, and that's where the main narrative business of this play occurs. Narratively, we're headed outside the city walls into festive space and time. Morally, however, we are already there from the very beginning, from Act 1, Scene 1. When we enter Jonson's play, when we enter Jonson's playhouse for this production, we are already at Bartholomew Fair. It is very hot and spicy festivity from the very first scene. Okay. Now, festivity. Jonson, of course, has a satirical target or targets in this play. But there's the main satirical target, well, maybe that's not quite right. The primary satirical target that he has is in Little Wit's household itself, and we can begin to open up that just by starting with the names, okay? Not Little Wit's name, we've dealt with that, and that's a separate issue. Jonson's concerns there have to do with language, with literature, with the nature of humor, the nature of genius, the nature of decorum, and so on. But with Wynne's name. Wynne, it's a short little name, it's short for something, you may think, and you're right. And normally, Wynne would be short for Winifred, a name that we don't hear very much anymore. Probably in 10 years, all the little girls will be called Winifred. It'll be the new Emma, maybe. Anyway, her name is not short for Winifred, we are told by John Littlewit. It's short for Win the Fight. That's her name. Win the Fight. Win for short. Her mother, with whom they, as you know, live, is called Dame Purecraft. Purecraft. And she has a very good friend who I think we are supposed to think may have beaten both Quarrelus and Winwife to the punch, as it were. She has a very good friend, a man whose surname is Busy, but his given name, his first name is Zeal of the Land. Zeal of the Land, Busy, is what he is called. Okay, what the heck is going on here? What's going on here is that Jonson is writing within and confronting an ongoing movement of what we can call cultural revolution in early modern England. We talked a couple of weeks ago when we looked at Shakespeare's sonnets, we talked very briefly about the historical earthquake of the Protestant Reformation and how that affected England, those bare ruined choirs that Shakespeare slips so beautifully and yet troublingly into Sonnet 73. In England and elsewhere, but perhaps especially in England, in Europe in this period, at the turn of the 17th century, in England, the Protestant Reformation was both an incomplete process and an ongoing process. Basically, this is a very long story for which you have to take a course with my colleague John Craig in the history department if you really want to understand it. But basically, England reformed, but incompletely. It retained a lot of the Roman Catholic structure and hierarchy of bishops and so on. And because the English Reformation was only partial from the very beginning, the English Protestant church divided between moderate and radical wings. The radical wing consisting of people who wanted a much more thorough, much more severe, much less compromising Reformation of the English form of Protestant Christianity. And to some extent, of course, this is typical of all revolutionary movements throughout history. There's always a more radical revolutionary than the revolutionary. In any case, there are these radical Protestants in late 16th and early 17th century England who really want to change things much more radically than they have been changed already. These people were called by their opponents, first of all. These people were called Puritans. Sometimes they were also called Precisians, which is a word Jonson uses elsewhere, but here we can work with the word Puritan. And among other things, Puritans were against stuff. That's how they were perceived, at least by non-Puritans. So they're against bishops, for example. They're against a lot of the ceremonial trappings of Christianity insofar as these were retained by the English Church. And they were very much against the English traditions of festivity. When they eventually came to power in the 1640s, for example, they banned Christmas, a fascinating and largely forgotten episode of 17th century English history. Christmas was illegal in England in the 1640s. They're very much against the traditional English culture of festivity, things like Bartholomew Fair. They're also very much against the theatre. From the very beginnings of the professional theatre in London in the 1570s, you've got Puritan, intense Puritan opposition to the theatre on a moral basis, basically. The theatre was perceived as an immoral location. Men and women coming together at close quarters, getting all excited in various ways. That can't be good. It was perceived as a site of sexual observation and sexual assignation, which made Puritans very upset. It was also a site of cross-dressing, the theatre, the early modern English theatre. And this is not anything the Puritans were kind of making up. It's true. The early modern English theatre, and this is a very, very interesting business, which you will hear much more about if you take some courses with my colleague Paul Boudra. The early modern English theatre is a cross-dressing theatre. Nobody really knows why this was the rule, but it was the rule. All roles on the early modern English stage are played by males. There are no women on the early modern English stage. So female parts are played either by boys or by slender young men, that kind of thing. Puritans hated that because, well, they obviously felt that was perverse. That was fostering gender confusion of various kinds, and they were very much against that. Jonson works in the theatre. Jonson's not a Puritan kind of personality. A conservative humanist, yes, but not a Puritan kind of person. And on top of all that, the King James, who came to power in 1603, King James clashed with Puritans a lot, hated them, and perceived them as a direct political threat to his sovereignty, to his rule. So it makes sense for a playwright like Jonson, who works for the king directly, part of the time, writing masques for James. It makes sense for Jonson to target Puritans on that account, too. So he does. The Puritans are, if you like, the bad guys of Bartholomew Fair and of this part of Jonson's career in general. And the basic critique that Jonson directs at Puritans in Bartholomew Fair is not especially sophisticated, perhaps not even very interesting. He claims that, look, Puritans are hypocrites. It's as simple as that. They claim to be holier than thou, not to have the same kinds of unruly desires that the rest of us ordinary folk have, but in fact, underneath, they are much nastier than you or I. That's the basic shape of Jonson's critique. And as I said, it's not that in and of itself is not especially clever or compelling. John Littlewhit's household is a Puritan, or at least a semi-Puritan household. Littlewhit is not Puritan, that's made very clear. And in fact, his job as a proctor in the ecclesiastical courts, and he talks about this, his job as a proctor is viewed as a kind of abomination by Puritans. So Wynne, and this is quite interesting, Wynne has kind of crossed a boundary and rebelled a bit in marrying this guy, John Littlewhit, who is not Puritan, not one of the faithful, not one of the saints, as they say in early modern Puritan discourse. You guys know, and this is a nice little glimpse into the concept of Puritanism in early modern Protestantism. It does have a legacy. You guys will know the Dixieland Jazz tune, "When the Saints Go Marching In," right? Oh, when the saints go marching in, go marching in. Oh, when the saints go marching in, go marching in. Those saints in that song, that's not Catholic saints. That's Protestant saints, Puritan saints. And if you read James Baldwin's, the American writer James Baldwin's breakout novel from the 1940s, Go Tell It on the Mountain, you'll find this discourse again. The entire congregation is called the Saints. So it's a vision of real moral and religious purity. Anyway, Wynne has rebelled a bit in marrying a guy who is not one of the saints, not a member of the Puritan community. Nonetheless, she was raised Puritan. Her mom, Dame Purecraft, is Puritan, and Dame Purecraft's friend, Zeal of the Land Busy, he is intensely Puritan. He's what's called a Puritan elder, which means he's not exactly in holy orders, but he's viewed as a kind of lay preacher, a wise older man, learned in the faith, to whom you can go if you have moral or religious questions. He's sometimes referred to as Rabbi Busy, which is a little bit confusing, or maybe it's very confusing. Puritans in early modern England placed a strong emphasis on the Old Testament, so the Jewish part of the Christian Bible, and accordingly they adopted, to some extent, Jewish nomenclature and Jewish religious terminology. So Rabbi Busy is not an insult. It's a nice way of, it's an honorific to call Zeal of the Land Busy Rabbi, even though, as we will see in a moment, and just before we get to the end of this surprisingly long lecture, even though, as we'll see, Busy is as anti-Semitic as anybody else in early modern England, and in fact is quite keen to distinguish himself and his brethren from Judaism. In any case, that is Jonson's at least initial satirical target in Bartholomew Fair, Puritans. His satirical claim, which again is not super complex, is that Puritans are hypocrites, and it's through Puritan hypocrisy that these people get to go to the actual fair. As I've said, Puritans are very much against festivity. For sure, they are against the disorder, the carnivalesque disorder of this annual public party, Bartholomew Fair on Smithfield. Nonetheless, both Littlewhit and Wynne want to go to the fair. So the question is, how do they get there? Littlewhit, in fact, as I said earlier, has written a play for the puppet show, which is going to be put on in the fair. And as we'll see, the climax and culmination of Jonson's play is that we actually get to go to Littlewhit's puppet show, and it's pretty amazing, I think. They want to go to the fair. How are they going to get there? They are constrained, Littlewit and Wynne, not only by a sense of filial duty, but also because they are living off of Dame Purecraft's money. So they need her, even though they're adults and married. They can't say to her, "Screw you, Mom, we're going to the fair." They have to find a way to, they have to find a license to get to the fair, a way in which it will be okay. And they do that beginning in Act 1, Scene 5. And I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip over and just kind of summarize some stuff. They do that in Act 1, Scene 5. We're looking at around line 155 on page 65 in our books, where this all starts to go down. Littlewit has an idea, and the idea involves pork. There's a lot of pork that gets roasted and eaten at the fair. Thing is, Puritans aren't really supposed to eat pork. At least these Puritans aren't, in Jonson's vision. These Puritans aren't supposed to eat pork. Why? Well, because of that emphasis on the Old Testament that I talked about. Because they're very interested in these Puritans, they're very interested in trying to live in accordance with the law of God as it's laid down in the Old Testament. And that includes some kind of deference to or reverence for the Jewish dietary laws, the laws of kosher, which are described in the book of Leviticus, chapter 11. If you want to check them out, that's where they are. One of the forbidden foods, forbidden meats in the kosher law, of course, is pork. You're not supposed to eat it, and accordingly, at least in Jonson's version of what early modern Puritanism is, Puritans aren't supposed to eat pork. There's a lot of pork being served in the fair. Littlewit comes up with an idea for how they can get there precisely through that pork. And he gets there, he comes up with this idea based on the notion that Wynne is pregnant. Now, it isn't entirely clear whether Wynne really is pregnant or whether this just is a notion they come up with. It's pretty perverse either way. But that's the notion they come up with. He tells Wynne that she should long for pork. And Littlewit will go get her mom and bring her in and say, "Oh, Wynne's in a bad way. If she doesn't get some pork, some roast pork, she's going to be sick." So top of page 66. Wynne says, "Yeah, go get my mom." She says, "I somewhat of the mother in me. You shall see, fetch her, fetch her." And then groaning, "Ah, ah." So we have young Wynne in her sexy outfit moaning for pork on stage. This is not getting any less spicy or any less festive as we go through Act 1 of Jonson's Bartholomew Fair. And let's try to finish up. Littlewit goes to get Dame Purecraft. She comes on. She is apprised of the notion that Wynne, doesn't want to go to the fair, but she has to have some pork. If she doesn't get some pork, she's just gonna die. And where can you get pork better than in that nest of iniquity, Bartholomew Fair on Smithfield. Act 1, Scene 6. Dame Purecraft gets Zeal of the Land busy to come on and give a judgment. Is it okay for us to go to the fair in order to eat some pork? And Busy kind of hems and haws a bit until finally he says, I'm now on page 68 in our course books, Act 1, Scene 6, from line 70. Zeal of the land Busy comes to a judgment. He says, surely it may be otherwise, but it is subject to construction, subject, and hath a face of offence with the weak a great face, a foul face. but that face may have a veil put over it and be shadowed, as it were. We're talking about eating pork here. It may be eaten, and in the fair, I take it, in a booth, the tents of the wicked. The place is not much, not very much. We may be religious in midst of the profane. So it be eaten with a reformed mouth, with sobriety and humbleness, not gorged in with gluttony or greediness. There's the fear. For should she go there as taking pride in the place, or delight in the unclean dressing, to feed the vanity of the eye, or the lust of the palate, it were not well, it were not fit, it were abominable, and not good. And he concludes, so that they all say, yes, that's right, of course, we're not going to go to the fair to do wicked things like eating pork wickedly. No, we're going to go to the fair to eat pork and maybe do other wicked things piously, with a religious mouth, because we're Puritans. It must be okay for us to do that. Busy concurs, and he says at the conclusion of this scene, Act 1, Scene 6, line 95, he says, you know what, I'm going to go with you to take care of you, to give you comfort. He says, in the way of comfort to the weak I will go and eat. I will eat exceedingly and prophesy. There may be a good use made of it too, now I think on't, by the public eating of swine's flesh, to profess our hate and loathing of Judaism, whereof the brethren stand taxed. I will therefore eat, yea, I will eat exceedingly. We end the scene, and we should now end this lecture within the next couple of minutes. Puritans aren't supposed to go to the fair. Puritans aren't supposed to eat pork. Why? Because it's wicked. Because they're Puritans. They don't do that stuff. Act 1, Scene 6, and Act 1 as a whole ends with these Puritans deciding they will go to the fair, they will go eat pork, not despite their being Puritans, but precisely because they are Puritans. Because they are Puritans, they can give themselves license to do wicked things, like going to the fair and eating pork, because they will do these things with a reformed mouth. They will do them religiously. And as we saw in that last line, Busy comes up with this other idea that it will be good if they go to the fair and eat pork, because that will show non-Puritans that they're not Jewish. Puritans were accused. So there's tremendous anti-Semitism in early modern England. Puritans had a fascination with Judaism, as I've said, and they were accordingly accused of being crypto-Jewish. So Busy says there, look, we'll go eat pork to show that we're not Jews. That's a kind of add-on justification. The main idea is precisely because they are pure inside, they claim a right to do impure things on the outside. And at that point, I think, Jonson's critique of Puritan hypocrisy becomes quite a bit more interesting. It becomes an inquiry, let's say, into the relationship between the inside and the outside, first of all, of a person as a moral entity, and second of all, of language, of discourse as a hermeneutic entity. So we end Act 1 of Jonson's play on the way to the fair, and we end Act 1 of Jonson's play in a very, very interesting, I think, articulation of the nature of hypocrisy, which Jonson wants to pursue further over the rest of the play. Okay, I'm going to stop there, you guys, as the light is failing and the wind is picking up and my fingers are getting very cold. I wish you an excellent weekend, the best you can possibly have, festively self-isolating, here at the end of week 12 in the spring semester of 2020, and I will get back to you with a third lecture on Bartholomew Fair pretty soon. Okay, thank you very much for watching as always, and bye-bye.